When a headline like this appears, the instinct is to assume exaggeration. Democrats quietly backtrack after a video goes viral. Sounds like the usual churn of modern politics, a brief embarrassment, a clumsy message, quickly corrected and soon forgotten. We have grown accustomed to such cycles. A video trends, outrage follows, statements are issued, and the machine moves on. But that assumption misunderstands what just happened, because this story is not dramatic in the way headlines usually are. It is worse in the quieter structural sense that matters far more over time. The prevailing media narrative suggests a misstep, an ill-advised recording, taken out of context, regretted after public reaction hardened. That framing is comforting. It reassures us that nothing fundamental was exposed, just another episode of political overreach corrected by public pressure. Yet the coverage misses the point. This was not a spontaneous error. It was not careless, and it was certainly not misunderstood by the people who produced it. What the public is now reacting to was meant to be seen. It was meant to test something: boundaries, tolerance, institutional restraint. And that is where this story actually begins. To understand the significance of the video, one has to set aside its surface message and examine its purpose. Officially, it was framed as advocacy, a declaration of values, a signal of resolve, a message designed to energize a sympathetic audience. That is how it was defended once criticism emerged. But advocacy does not usually require the particular imagery, language, and timing that characterize this release. This was a signal, not a statement. It was designed for two audiences at once. The first was the public, a demonstration that certain norms could now be challenged openly, that moral certainty could substitute for procedural restraint. The second was internal, a message to allies, activists, and institutional actors that the ground had shifted. Notice what was absent. There was no uncertainty, no exploratory language, no acknowledgement of competing obligations. The tone was declarative, almost instructional. It assumed consensus rather than seeking it. That suggests preparation, coordination, and confidence that the institutional safeguards which once would have discouraged such messaging were no longer operative. This was not improvisation, it was conditioning. Up to this point, much of American politics has been explained away as rhetorical escalation. Hard language, we are told, reflects hard times. But this incident moved beyond rhetoric. This is where lines matter. Institutions, whether military, legal, or administrative, are not preserved by intention alone. They rely on restraint, on shared understandings of what must not be politicized, even when passions run high. At some point, institutions must respond, not to protect one party or another, but to protect the concept of neutrality itself. This is not theoretical. When political messaging encroaches on spaces traditionally insulated from partisan signaling, it creates precedents. And precedents, once established, rarely remain isolated. Here, the concern was not the opinion expressed, but the institutional posture implied. The suggestion that certain outcomes are pre-authorized, that accountability flows in one direction, that authority is moral rather than procedural. History is unambiguous on this point. When institutions become perceived instruments of faction, their legitimacy erodes rapidly and rarely recovers without crisis. The reaction, however, did not land where many expected. Initially, criticism was dismissed as predictable disapproval, familiar voices, repeat arguments, partisan reflexes. But then the backlash began to reach an unexpected figure. Someone was standing, with credentials, with a resume that could not be easily dismissed as fringe or opportunistic. This individual was not an activist nor a commentator dependent on outrage for relevance. Their authority derived precisely from the institutional norms now under scrutiny. And that difference mattered. When criticism emerges from within the professional class that benefits most from stability, it changes the equation. Media outrage can be managed. Institutional concern cannot. Quietly, the conversation shifted. Statements followed, carefully worded, deliberately narrow. They did not apologize. They did not fully endorse. They clarified. And in bureaucratic language, clarification often signals retreat. The emphasis moved away from intent and toward process, from moral urgency to procedural neutrality, from confidence to caution. This contrast mattered. Emotional political framing had collided with institutional logic, and institutional logic prevailed, if only partially. No one announced a reversal. No one conceded error. Instead, there was a recalibration, subtle, deliberate, unmistakable, to those accustomed to reading power dynamics rather than press releases. This was seriousness without drama, and that is often the most decisive kind. The public reaction among defenders grew strained. Language hardened. Credentials were emphasized. Past achievements were recited not as context but as armor. When authority feels threatened, it often retreats into resume padding. Tone changed as well. What had been certainty became insistence. What had been moral clarity slipped into defensiveness. This was not panic in the theatrical sense. It was instability, the subtle awareness that something expected to pass quietly. Had not psychologically, this pattern is familiar. When a narrative fails to land as intended, repetition replaces persuasion, volume substitutes for coherence, and explanation gives way to accusation. Friendly media outlets acted in as they usually do to soften the edges. The focus shifted to intention rather than impact, to feelings rather than implications. Questions of procedure were reframed as personal attacks. Accountability morphed into persecution. Sympathy replaced scrutiny. But legal and institutional realities do not respond to tone. They respond to precedent. And precedent does not dissolve because coverage becomes gentle. This is how accountability erodes, not through outright defiance, but through narrative substitution. When emotion is offered as a defense, structure quietly disappears. Seen in isolation, this episode might appear contained, but it aligns too precisely with a broader pattern to ignore. Institutional decay rarely announces itself. It advances through small exceptions justified as necessary, temporary, or morally urgent. We have seen this before: selective enforcement, narrative protection, deferred accountability. What makes this moment different is not the act itself, but the response to resistance. The retreat was real, however understated, and it suggests an awareness, perhaps belated, that some boundaries still invoke consequences. Why now? Why this case? Possibly because the accumulation of unresolved exemptions has reached a point where institutional actors sense real exposure. Not political exposure, structural exposure. So the question is not who won the day. The real questions are these: will this recalibration hold, or will it be quietly reversed once attention fades? And have institutions rediscovered the impulse to defend their own legitimacy, or merely postpone the reckoning? This is a fork in the road, not toward certainty, but toward restraint or escalation. Either path carries consequences. In the end, the irony is unmistakable. An action designed to project moral authority revealed institutional vulnerability. A message meant to normalize a shift exposed resistance to it. And a video intended to mobilize instead forced retreat. Quietly, carefully, without acknowledgement. But moments like this leave traces. They signal limits. And limits once felt are not easily forgotten. Whether those limits are respected or merely tested again under a different name remains unresolved. And that uncertainty is the most consequential thing of all.